The warm, dancing light from the menorah cast long shadows across the living room, painting the faces gathered around it in hues of gold and orange. The air, thick with the scent of fried latkes and beeswax, usually felt like a comforting hug during Hanukkah. But this year, a chill snaked through the festive warmth. As the last candle flickered to life, completing the row of 8, a voice cut through the quiet reverence. It was Asher, my cousin, leaning against the doorway, a half-smile playing on his lips. "Quaint fables for the naive, aren't they?" he said, his voice just loud enough for everyone to hear, but pitched to sound casual, almost an aside. His gaze swept over the candles, then flickered to the old prayer book in my hand. All these ancient traditions. Really, in this day and age? His words, delivered with that familiar condescending sneer, landed like a cold splash of water on the glowing scene. My heart, which had been swelling with the familiar joy of the festival, tightened. It wasn't just the words, it was the public nature of his dismissal, the way he looked at our shared heritage as something childish, something to be outgrown. He knew how much these traditions meant to me, how deeply they were woven into the fabric of my being. His comment was a direct hit, aimed precisely at the core of my beliefs. I felt a familiar clenching in my jaw, a subtle tightening that usually signaled the start of a heated argument. But not tonight. Tonight something was different. I didn't react with anger, didn't snap back with a defense of our faith. Instead, an unsettling calm settled over me. I simply held Asher's gaze for a beat too long, letting the silence stretch, heavy and thick with unspoken intent. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a silent promise of a reckoning that was yet to come. I could feel the eyes of our family on us, sensing the shift, but I didn't break. Just then, a small draft from an open window momentarily threatened one of the menorah's flames. It dipped, flickered precariously, and for a fleeting second, it seemed to mirror the momentary dip in my own spirit. But then, as if spurred by an unseen force, it caught itself, straightened and burned brighter than before, its light a defiant spear against the encroaching shadow. A quiet, resolute thought formed in my mind, clear as the ringing of a bell. Some lights, once rekindled, burn brighter than before, illuminating truths others prefer to keep hidden. This wasn't just about Asher's words anymore. This was about something deeper, something within me that had been simmering for a long time. His contempt, instead of extinguishing my flame, had only fanned it, igniting a deeper commitment to the tradition he so casually dismissed. I shifted my gaze from Asher, letting his sneer fade from my focus. My eyes settled on that now steady flame, watching its unwavering dance. There was a knowing glint in my eye, a spark of resolve that hadn't been there moments before. What this newfound determination would bring, I wasn't entirely sure. But I knew one thing. Things were about to change. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell us where you are watching from in the comments below. My earliest memories are steeped in the rich aroma of baking challah and frying latkes, the low hum of ancient prayers, and the joyful chaos of family gatherings. I grew up in a small, close-knit community, nestled in what felt like a timeless corner of the city. Our days moved to a rhythm set by the Jewish calendar, each festival a vibrant thread woven into the fabric of our lives. Hanukkah especially was a time of magic. The streets, though modern, still echoed with stories from centuries past, and our homes were sanctuaries where history felt alive. Every year, as the days grew shorter and the air turned crisp, the anticipation for Hanukkah would build. My grandmother, with her hands gnarled from a lifetime of kneading dough, would start preparing the potato latkes, their savory scent filling every corner of our small apartment. My grandfather, his eyes twinkling behind thick glasses, would meticulously check the menorah, ensuring each candle holder was polished to a shine. He'd tell us stories of Judah Maccabee and his brave warriors, not as distant heroes, but as real people whose courage still resonated in our lives. We'd gather around the flickering candles, the flames dancing reflections in our excited faces. The dreidel games were always boisterous, pennies and chocolate gilt piling up and changing hands with gleeful shouts. But it was the telling of the story, the recounting of the miracles that truly captivated me. My grandfather had a way of bringing the ancient texts to life, making the struggle for religious freedom feel immediate and personal. He taught us that Hanukkah wasn't just about lights, it was about resilience, about standing firm in what you believe, even when faced with overwhelming odds. I was a quiet child, often found in a corner, lost in a book, or simply observing the world around me. The stories of our ancestors, their unwavering faith and their fight for their identity, deeply affected me. I dreamed of becoming a guardian of these traditions, of ensuring that the flame of our heritage would never dim. I imagined myself as a scholar, delving into old texts, uncovering forgotten meanings and sharing them with new generations. The thought of preserving this rich legacy filled me with a sense of purpose, a quiet resolve that simmered beneath my gentle exterior. Asher was always there, a constant presence in these childhood scenes. He was my cousin, a few years older, and initially he participated in everything. He'd spin the dreidel with us, sometimes cheating good-naturedly, and he'd eat his share of latkes. But even then, there was a subtle difference in his approach. While we listened to my grandfather's stories with wide-eyed wonder, Asher would often lean back, a slight smirk playing on his lips as if he knew something we didn't. He'd ask questions that felt less like genuine curiosity and more like challenges. I remember one Hanukkah when he was about 10. My grandfather was explaining the miracle of the oil, how one day's supply lasted for 8. Asher piped up, "But Grandpa, how do we know that really happened? Isn't it just a story to make us feel good?" My grandfather, ever patient, explained faith and tradition, but Asher's question, though innocent sounding, carried a hint of the cynicism that would later define him. It was a small crack in the shared reverence, a tiny seed of doubt planted in the fertile ground of our traditions. He was part of my formative years, a shadow in the bright glow of our shared heritage, setting the stage for the discord that would later erupt. His early detachment was a quiet prelude to the open disrespect that would eventually shatter our festive peace. The small crack in our shared reverence, that tiny seed of doubt Asher planted, grew steadily over the years, widening into a chasm between us. It wasn't a sudden break, but a slow, almost imperceptible erosion of our relationship, chipped away by countless moments that, in isolation, seemed minor, but together formed a deep wound. I can recall specific instances, sharp and clear like photographs in my mind. There was the time I excitedly told him about my plans to study ancient Hebrew texts in college, hoping to delve deeper into the very stories my grandfather had brought to life. Asher, then already pursuing a business degree, just chuckled. "Old-fashioned, isn't it? All that dusty history. What's the practical application? You won't make a dime off that, cousin." His words, delivered with a dismissive wave of his hand, felt like a slap. He wasn't just questioning my career choice, he was belittling my passion, my connection to our heritage, framing it as an impractical hobby for the naive. It wasn't a direct insult, but a veiled humiliation, implying my aspirations were less worthy than his own, more modern pursuits. Another memory surfaces from a family gathering during Sukkot. Our community was building a sukkah, a temporary hut symbolizing the shelters our ancestors used in the desert. Everyone was pitching in, laughing, sharing stories. I was carefully weaving palm fronds for the roof, a task my grandmother had taught me. Asher walked by, a new smartphone in his hand, barely glancing at our work. He loudly declared to anyone within earshot, "Honestly, all this effort for a hut will dismantle in a week. Couldn't we just order a tent? so much more efficient. He didn't offer to help, didn't even pretend interest. His comment hung in the air, a subtle but undeniable dismissal of the communal effort, the symbolic meaning, and the joy we found in the tradition. He made it sound foolish, a waste of time, manipulating the atmosphere with his casual scorn, pushing his modern efficiency over our shared cultural practice. Then there were the family discussions about the synagogue's fundraising efforts. I was passionate about preserving the old building, its stained glass windows telling stories of generations past. Asher, who had recently joined the synagogue board, argued for selling a section of the property to a developer, promising a bigger, more state-of-the-art community center. He presented it as a pragmatic business decision, ignoring the emotional and historical ties many of us had to the existing structure. He spoke of optimizing assets and future-proofing, words that felt cold and calculating, completely devoid of the reverence I felt for our sacred spaces. When I voiced my concerns, he just smiled, a patronizing glint in his eye, and said, "Some people just can't let go of the past, can they? Progress waits for no one." It felt like a deliberate move to gain influence, to reshape our community in his image, at the expense of our collective memory and values. His actions subtly manipulated family dynamics, creating an unfair advantage for himself by presenting himself as the forward thinker, leaving me feeling sidelined and my values disregarded. Within our close-knit community, these acts of disrespect, though often subtle, were deeply felt. There's a certain cultural expectation, an unspoken agreement that traditions are honored. Asher's constant chipping away at these norms created an uncomfortable tension. People would exchange glances when he made a dismissive remark, a quiet understanding passing between us that something wasn't quite right. No one openly challenged him, perhaps out of politeness or a desire to avoid conflict, but his behavior fostered a subtle ostracization, a quiet pulling away. He wasn't overtly shunned, but a distance grew, a sense that he was operating outside the unspoken rules of our shared heritage. His comment during the Menorah lighting in Part 1, dismissing Hanukkah as quaint fables, wasn't a sudden outburst. It was the culmination of years, decades even, of these small, consistent slights. It was the final insult, the last drop in a bucket that had been slowly filling with disregard and disrespect. The sting wasn't just from that one remark. It was the echo of every past slight, every veiled humiliation, every instance where he had diminished what I held sacred. It was the weight of all that accumulated emotional wear and tear finally breaking through the surface. The emotional atmosphere in our family gatherings, once warm and comforting, now felt increasingly heavy. My attempts to bridge the growing divide with Asher were met with a wall of resistance. I'd try to bring up a shared memory, a funny story from our childhood Hanukkahs, hoping to remind him of the connection we once had to these traditions. He would just nod vaguely, his eyes scanning the room as if looking for someone more interesting to talk to, or he would change the subject abruptly to business or politics, topics where he felt he had the upper hand. Sometimes he'd even cut me off mid-sentence, saying something like, "Look, I get it, you like the old ways, but the world moves on, you know." It wasn't just dismissal, it was a deliberate turning away, a refusal to engage with anything that reminded him of our shared past or my deeply held beliefs. Our discussions, which used to be lively and respectful, now intensified into sharp intellectual sparring matches. These weren't shouting matches. Asher was too polished for that. Instead, he'd use logic and what he called rational thought to dismantle my arguments for tradition. I remember one dinner where I spoke about the beauty of the Hanukkah story, the miracle of the oil, and the resilience of our ancestors. Asher leaned forward, a slight smirk playing on his lips, and said, "Isn't it more likely a clever piece of propaganda to rally a struggling people? A good story, sure, but a miracle. Come on, you're smarter than that. His disdain for tradition wasn't just pronounced. It felt personal, aimed directly at my intelligence for believing in something he considered folklore. He'd bring up scientific facts, historical accounts that questioned the literal interpretations, always with that air of superior knowledge, making me feel naive for my faith. This period also brought increased social pressures. It wasn't just Asher. I started to feel the subtle judgment from other family members. Some, influenced by Asher's confident modern stance, would make comments like, "It's nice you're so dedicated, but maybe it's time to adapt a little," or "Asher has some good points about looking forward." These weren't malicious, but they created a sense of isolation. I felt like I was constantly defending my beliefs not just to Asher, but to a wider circle. Even within the community, some people started to observe our growing rift with concern. I'd catch whispers, see glances, and feel a quiet pressure to conform, to keep silent about my convictions, or to just get along for the sake of family harmony. It was a difficult position, feeling like I was an outlier clinging to something others were ready to let go of. Asher's behavior worsened. He became more overtly critical and dismissive, almost enjoying the opportunity to mock my continued devotion to Hanukkah traditions. During one community event, a Hanukkah fair, he approached me while I was helping children spin dreidels. He loudly asked, "Still playing with these old toys? Don't these kids have iPads now? Seems a bit anachronistic, don't you think?" He wasn't just questioning the relevance of ancient stories, he was mocking the very act of engaging with them. He might publicly question the relevance of ancient stories in a contemporary world, asking rhetorical questions about how a story from 2,000 years ago could possibly apply to today's challenges, all to a captive audience of relatives and friends. It felt like a deliberate attempt to undermine my efforts and to further alienate me from the very traditions I held dear. This was the peak of emotional suffocation for me. I felt trapped between my unwavering beliefs and the relentless pressure from Asher, and by extension, parts of my social circle. Every conversation felt like a minefield. Every family gathering, once a source of comfort, now filled me with dread. I was constantly on guard, preparing for the next subtle jab, the next intellectual challenge, the next dismissive comment. It felt like I was holding my breath, waiting for something to give. This was the precipice, the moment right before a major shift where something had to change, because continuing like this was simply unsustainable. My spirit was being worn down, piece by piece, and I knew deep down that I couldn't just keep taking it. Then came the moment everything changed. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but a slow, creeping realization, like a shadow lengthening until it covered everything. It started with an old photograph tucked away in my grandmother's attic. I was helping her clean, dusting off boxes filled with memories, when I stumbled upon a faded picture of Asher and his father, taken when Asher was just a boy. They were standing in front of a synagogue, a place I knew well, but the look on Asher's father's face was one I'd never seen him wear. A mix of pride and something else, something almost desperate. Later that week, I was talking to my great-aunt Sarah, who has always had a knack for remembering every family story, every secret. I showed her the photo, asking about Asher's father. Her eyes softened with a sadness I didn't understand at first. She told me Asher's father, my uncle, had once been deeply involved in the community. He wasn't attacking me. He was attacking the ghost of a past betrayal. Understanding this changed everything. It didn't excuse his behavior, but it gave me a different lens through which to view it. It also made me realize that passive acceptance was no longer an option. I couldn't just keep taking his comments, not when I understood the pain behind them, and not when I saw how it was eroding our family. I made a firm decision right then and there. I would reclaim our narrative. I would actively defend the value of our heritage, not just for myself, but for the memory of my uncle, and perhaps for Asher himself. A few weeks later, an unexpected opportunity arose. The local community center announced a Festival of Lights cultural event, open to everyone, not just our community. They were looking for volunteers to showcase different aspects of Hanukkah traditions. This was it. This was my chance. I saw it as an opportunity to not just preserve, but to celebrate and share the beauty and relevance of Hanukkah traditions with a wider audience. It would directly counter Asher's dismissive narrative, not through argument, but through living example. This moment shattered the cycle of suffering. I wasn't just defending, I was building. I wasn't just enduring, I was creating. The story was shifting, and I was finally taking the reins. The immediate aftermath of my decision to take part in the Festival of Lights felt like a whirlwind, a mix of exhilaration and stark terror. I had committed to something big, something public, and suddenly all the private battles with Asher felt exposed. There was a profound internal struggle happening inside me. Doubt gnawed at the edges of my resolve. Had I overreacted? Was I making things worse? The thought of further alienating Asher, despite everything, still stung. There was a deep-seated fear of public scrutiny, of being judged not just by Asher, but by everyone who knew our family dynamic. Sometimes a wave of shame would wash over me, a feeling that I was airing our dirty laundry for all to see. Other times, a raw, almost volcanic anger would surface, a long-suppressed emotional pain finally breaking through. It was a confusing, exhausting time. My family's reactions were a mixed bag, revealing the complex cultural dynamics at play. My great-aunt, of course, was my staunchest ally. She saw my participation as a vindication of her brother's memory, a way to heal old wounds. She offered unwavering support, her eyes twinkling with a knowing pride. My mother, however, was more cautious. She valued family unity above almost anything else, a common sentiment in our culture. She gently urged me to consider the implications, to not make things messy. She didn't want a public confrontation, preferring quiet reconciliation. Her concern was palpable, a reflection of the pressure within our community to maintain harmony, even if it meant burying disagreements. "Can you just talk to him?" she'd ask, her voice soft but insistent. Some friends were incredibly supportive, cheering me on and offering practical help for the festival. They saw my stand as brave, a necessary step. But then there were others who, perhaps influenced by Asher's subtle campaigning or their own biases towards modernity, revealed themselves as antagonists. They might not have said anything directly, but their sideways glances, the sudden silences when I entered a room, or the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly, spoke volumes, and it made me feel isolated, as if I was challenging not just Asher, but a certain segment of our social fabric. The cultural expectation for family unity, for not rocking the boat, was a heavy weight. I felt pressure to back down, to conform, to simply let things be. The profound psychological impact of this period was immense. Sleep became a luxury. My mind constantly replayed past conversations with Asher, analyzing every word, every look. I found myself second-guessing my beliefs, questioning the very foundations I stood upon. Was I being stubborn, self-righteous, or was I truly fighting for something important? Maintaining my identity and beliefs in the face of this adversity felt like an uphill battle, a constant struggle against internal doubts and external pressures. It was a period of intense personal growth, forcing me to truly examine what I believed and why. I had to learn to trust my own convictions even when they put me at odds with those I cared about. The challenge was not just about Hanukkah, it was about defining myself. This wasn't merely about setting up a table at a festival. It was about setting a boundary, about asserting my voice, and hoping that in doing so I could somehow, against all odds, bridge the chasm that had opened between Asher and me, or at the very least, honor the traditions that meant so much. The dust from the confrontation began to settle, and I started the slow, deliberate process of rebuilding. It wasn't just my life I was putting back together, but my identity, strengthened now by a conviction that felt rock solid. The festival, though initially a source of immense stress, became the foundation for this reconstruction. It was a tangible way to channel all that raw emotion, all that energy, into something positive and lasting. I poured myself into the preparations, working alongside my great-aunt and the growing number of community members who had rallied to our cause. Each latke fried, each menorah polished, each story shared, felt like a small act of defiance against the cynicism that had tried to dim our light. As for Asher, his resolution was quiet, almost understated, yet entirely fitting. The community, while valuing harmony, also valued respect for tradition. His public dismissal of Hanukkah, coupled with my rather public yet respectful stand, had shifted the social currents. He wasn't ostracized, not overtly, but there was a subtle distance. Invitations to community events became less frequent. Conversations with him grew shorter, less engaged. He hadn't had a dramatic downfall, no grand public shaming. Instead, there was a gradual, almost imperceptible withdrawal from the very social circles he had once sought to impress with his modern views. He still attended family gatherings, but he was quieter, his sneers replaced by a more subdued, almost melancholic expression. He had in essence faded into the background, his influence over our shared narrative diminished. Our paths diverged, not with a bang, but with a quiet mutual understanding that some bridges once burned cannot be fully rebuilt, only acknowledged from a distance. The narrative simply moved beyond his destructive influence, allowing me to thrive. My re-emergence wasn't sudden, but a steady growing presence. The festival was a success, drawing in more people than ever before, some curious, some nostalgic, all touched by the warmth and authenticity of the celebration. I found myself speaking more, sharing stories, explaining the deeper meanings behind the rituals. I started leading community workshops on Hanukkah traditions, teaching children how to make dry doughs and elders how to bake traditional holiday breads. I became a respected figure, a beacon for those who valued heritage, not just in our community, but in the wider cultural sphere. People looked to me, not just for knowledge, but for the quiet strength I had shown. It was a role I never sought, but one I embraced with open arms, feeling a profound sense of purpose. Looking back, the journey was a crucible. It tested my faith, my patience, and my resolve. But it also forged something stronger within me. The resilience I found, the unwavering belief in the enduring power of tradition, the courage to stand up for what I believed in, these were the true gifts. Hanukkah, the feast of dedication, had always been about the triumph of light over darkness, of perseverance against overwhelming odds. My own story, in a small way, mirrored that ancient tale. The oil that lasted 8 days, the small band of Maccabees against a mighty empire, the flickering candle illuminating the darkest night. These weren't just quaint fables. They were living truths, embodying the spirit of hope and the lasting legacy of cultural and spiritual heritage. My journey taught me that some lights, once almost extinguished, can burn brighter than before, not just for ourselves, but for an entire community, illuminating truths that others had tried to keep hidden. And in that light, I found my place, not just as a guardian of tradition, but as a